You know, there's something almost comedic about the way aliens consistently underestimate humans. It's like watching a species with 3 advanced degrees in astrophysics try to figure out why the toaster keeps burning their bread. They can calculate the trajectory of a comet through 17 different star systems, but ask them to understand human emotional responses, and suddenly they're about as useful as a chocolate teapot. The Zephyrians were no different. Oh, they thought they were so sophisticated with their crystalline cities and their floating meditation gardens. Real peaceful types, you understand. The kind who'd spend 3 hours discussing the philosophical implications of stepping on a flower. Which, let me tell you, made what happened next absolutely delicious in its irony. According to YouTube analytics, 98% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Captain Marcus Chen had been stationed on Zephyria Prime for exactly 4 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days when it happened. Not that he was counting or anything. He was just there as part of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, trying to negotiate mining rights for some rare minerals that Earth desperately needed. Standard stuff. Boring, even. The kind of assignment that makes you question your life choices and wonder if your guidance counselor back in high school was having a particularly vindictive day when they suggested interstellar relations as a career path. Marcus had brought his wife along because, honestly, 4 months on a planet where the primary form of entertainment was watching crystals grow seemed like a special kind of torture to endure alone. Elena Chen was everything Marcus wasn't. Diplomatic where he was blunt, patient where he was explosive, and possessed of the remarkable ability to smile pleasantly while mentally calculating exactly how many ways she could end you with a soup spoon. She was also, as it turned out, exactly the kind of person who could charm an entire alien council into considering humanity's requests seriously. The Zephyrians adored her. They'd literally formed a queue to bask in her presence during the welcome ceremonies. It was like watching a bunch of overgrown houseplants compete for the best spot by a window, which made it all the more baffling when Counselor Veltar decided she was a threat. Now, Veltar was what you might generously call a traditionalist. The less generous among us might use terms like xenophobic zealot, or the kind of being who probably pulls wings off flies for fun, if Zephyria had flies, which it doesn't, but you get the idea. He'd been against the negotiations from the start, muttering about contamination of pure Zephyrian culture and the aggressive nature of the human species. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife and serve it at a dinner party. Veltar had a champion, because of course he did. The Zephyrians, for all their talk of peace and enlightenment, still maintained the ancient tradition of trial by combat. They just called it conflict resolution through physical manifestation of spiritual truth, because apparently regular words weren't pretentious enough. The champion's name was Corveth, and he stood 8 feet tall with skin like polished obsidian and muscles that suggested he'd been carved by someone who really liked the idea of intimidation as an art form. He had 4 arms, each ending in hands that could probably crush a bowling ball, and eyes like burning coals. The kind of being that made you wonder what exactly the Zephyrians had been eating during their peaceful evolution. Marcus had seen him during the formal presentations and had done the mental math. The conclusion was not encouraging, but Elena, bless her diplomatic heart, had actually managed to make friends with a terrifying death machine. Turns out Corveth was fascinated by human poetry, of all things. He'd spent hours listening to Elena recite everything from Shakespeare to Maya Angelou, his massive head tilted like a curious dog trying to understand why humans would willingly arrange words in ways that made them feel emotions. It was actually kind of sweet, in a Beauty and the Beast sort of way. If the Beast had been designed by someone with a serious case of overcompensation issues. So when Veltar accused Elena of corrupting the spiritual purity of our greatest warrior with her alien poison, claiming she was using some kind of human mind control to turn Corveth against his own people, well, that's when things got interesting. The trial was set for the next morning. Standard Zephyrian justice, accusation, defense, and then someone's champion beats the living daylights out of someone else's champion while everyone pretends this is a civilized way to settle disputes. Elena would need to choose a champion to fight Corveth. The smart money was on Marcus politely declining and requesting diplomatic immunity. After all, he was human. What was he going to do against an 8-foot-tall, 4-armed, professionally murderous alien warrior? Die creatively? But here's the thing about humans that the galaxy never quite seems to grasp. We're not reasonable. Reasonable species don't look at a vast, empty cosmos filled with things that want to eat them and think, you know what this needs? More humans. Reasonable species don't develop their recreational activities around the concept of, let's see how close we can come to death without actually dying. Reasonable species don't pack bond with literally everything, including their predators. Marcus looked at his wife sitting there in those ridiculous crystal shackles, bruised from Veltar's gentle restraint, and something in his brain just switched off. Or maybe switched on. It's hard to tell with humans sometimes. "I'll be her champion," he said, in the tone of voice one might use to order coffee. The collective gasp from the Zephyrian Council was audible from 3 rooms away. Even Elena looked at him like he'd announced his intention to take up professional volcano diving. "Marcus," she said carefully, "Corveth is 8 feet tall. I noticed. He has 4 arms. Yep. Each of those arms can probably bench press a small car. Probably. And you're planning to fight him with what, exactly? Harsh language and good intentions?" Marcus smiled, and it was not a particularly nice smile. Something like that. The Zephyrians, bless their crystalline hearts, actually tried to talk him out of it. They explained, very patiently and using small words, that trial by combat was meant to be between champions of roughly equal ability. They pointed out that humans were fragile little meat bags who couldn't even survive in their natural environment without wrapping themselves in artificial climate control. They mentioned, with admirable diplomatic tact, that watching Corveth accidentally liquefy a human in the first 30 seconds might traumatize the younglings in attendance. Marcus listened to all of this with the expression of someone being told that water is wet and fire is hot. "Are you done?" he asked when they finished. "We merely wish to spare you unnecessary." "Great. When do we start?" You had to admire the bureaucratic determination of the Zephyrians. They spent the rest of the evening trying to find loopholes, precedents, anything that might prevent what they were absolutely convinced would be a massacre. They offered to accept Elena's exile instead. They suggested alternative forms of trial. They even proposed letting Marcus arm himself with any weapon of his choosing, apparently under the impression that giving a human sharp objects was somehow supposed to make the situation less concerning. Marcus declined everything except the weapon offer. He spent 20 minutes examining their available armaments before selecting, of all things, a simple metal rod about 3 feet long and 2 inches in diameter. The Zephyrians looked at each other in confusion. Even by human standards, this seemed like bringing a really inadequate knife to a gunfight. The arena was packed the next morning. Word had spread through the crystalline city like wildfire, and apparently the chance to watch a human get creatively dismembered was too entertaining to miss. The betting pools had Marcus lasting somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes, depending on whether Corveth decided to play with his food first. Elena sat in the designated area for the accused, still shackled but now wearing the expression of someone who had married a complete lunatic and was only just now realizing it. She kept looking between Marcus and Corveth like she was watching a tennis match played with hand grenades. Corveth entered the arena to thunderous applause. He'd painted ritual symbols across his obsidian skin and wore ceremonial armor that probably cost more than most people's houses. He moved like liquid death, all flowing grace and barely contained violence. When he raised his 4 arms to acknowledge the crowd, the roar was deafening. Marcus walked, in wearing his standard diplomatic uniform and carrying his metal rod like he was going for a leisurely stroll. The crowd went silent. Not the dramatic, anticipatory kind of silence. More the "did someone forget to feed the sacrifice to the volcano" kind of silence. The referee, a elderly Zephyrian with more crystals embedded in his skin than seemed strictly necessary, approached the center of the arena. He began the traditional pre-combat ceremony, which involved a lot of chanting about spiritual truth and the sacred nature of violence and various other philosophical contradictions that probably made sense if you were high enough on meditation. During this, Marcus did something that made Elena's blood run cold and the crowd shift uneasily. He started to laugh. Not maniacal laughter. Not the desperate giggling of someone having a nervous breakdown. Just laughter. The kind of genuine amusement you might have when watching a particularly entertaining comedy show. He stood there, metal rod resting casually on his shoulder, and chuckled like someone had just told him the best joke he'd heard all week. Corveth noticed. Those burning coal eyes fixed on the small human with something that might have been curiosity. In all his years of combat, he'd never seen a challenger laugh before a fight. Fear, yes. Anger, certainly. Grim determination, frequently. But amusement? That was new. The ceremony concluded, and the referee stepped back. The traditional combat circle was drawn in the sand, 30 feet in diameter, with ancient symbols marking the boundaries. Step outside the circle, and you forfeit. Fall and fail to rise within 10 counts, and you lose. Death. Well, death was generally considered a forfeit. But the rules didn't specifically say so because the Zephyrians had apparently never considered the possibility that someone might be unclear on this point. Champions, the referee announced. You may begin when... Marcus moved. Human beings, as a species, are not particularly impressive physical specimens. They're slower than most predators, weaker than most prey animals, and possess all the natural weaponry of a particularly aggressive mushroom. What they do have, and what the galaxy consistently fails to account for, is the most ridiculously over-engineered brain in known space, attached to a nervous system that can make split-second decisions faster than most computers. When a human decides to hurt something, they don't just use their muscles. They use physics. Marcus covered the distance between himself and Corveth in 3 steps. The metal rod, which had seemed like such an inadequate weapon, whistled through the air in an arc that had been precisely calculated to intersect with Corveth's center of mass, at exactly the right angle to transfer maximum kinetic energy. Corveth, trained warrior that he was, began to react. His forearms came up in a defensive posture that had been drilled into him through thousands of hours of practice. It was a perfect defensive stance, one that could deflect or absorb almost any conventional attack. The key word being conventional. Marcus wasn't trying to hit Corveth. He was trying to hit the ground. The metal rod struck the arena floor with a sound like thunder. The impact, channeled through Marcus's entire body weight and focused into a single point, created a shock wave that rippled through the sand. Corveth, caught in mid-defensive stance, suddenly found himself standing on an unstable surface that was moving in ways that his four-armed balance system had never been designed to handle. He stumbled. Not much, just a half step backward as he tried to regain his footing. Marcus was already moving again. The second strike came not from above, but from the side, the metal rod spinning in Marcus's hands like he was conducting the world's most violent orchestra. This time he aimed for Corveth's knee. Not to damage it, but to use it as a pivot point. Physics, as it turns out, is quite democratic. It applies to everyone equally, regardless of size, species, or how many arms you happen to have. When you apply leverage correctly, mass becomes less relevant than position. Corveth found himself airborne. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible from orbit. 8 feet of alien warrior, spinning helplessly through the air, arms windmilling as he tried to find something, anything, to grab onto. Time seemed to slow as every being in the arena watched the impossible sight of their greatest champion being casually tossed around by a creature barely half his size. Marcus, meanwhile, was already positioning himself for Corveth's landing. The impact was spectacular. Corveth hit the sand with enough force to create a small crater, his limbs sprawling at angles that suggested his dignity had died on impact. Sand exploded outward in a perfect circle, and for a moment, the arena was filled with a cloud of dust that obscured everything. When it cleared, Marcus was standing over Corveth with the metal rod pressed gently against the alien's throat. Not threatening exactly, more like a friendly reminder of who was currently in charge of the situation. "You know," Marcus said conversationally, his voice carrying clearly in the dead silence of the arena, "I really should thank you." Corveth blinked his coal-fire eyes, apparently trying to figure out how he'd gone from about to crush a human to lying in a crater with a rod at his throat in the space of approximately 15 seconds. "Thank me," he rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. "Oh yes, you see, I've been doing diplomatic work for 8 years now, and it's all very civilized and proper and mind-numbingly boring. Lots of sitting around talking about trade agreements and cultural exchange protocols. Very rarely do I get to solve problems the old-fashioned way." Marcus's grin was the kind that made Elena simultaneously proud and terrified. "But then your boss decided to hurt my wife, and suddenly all those years of mandatory diplomatic training went right out the window. And I remembered why humans used to rule their planet by hitting things with sticks until the things stopped being problems." He leaned down slightly, close enough that Corveth could see the absolute lack of mercy in his eyes. "The thing about humans, my friend, is that we're persistence predators. We don't just hunt our prey. We chase it until it dies of exhaustion. We don't just fight our enemies. We find their weaknesses and exploit them until they can't fight back. And we don't just love our mates." The rod pressed down just a fraction more. "We become absolutely, irrationally, catastrophically violent when someone threatens them." Corveth stared up at the human standing over him and experienced something that was completely new in his long career of professional violence: the absolute certainty that he was outmatched. Not just physically, though the casual ease with which this small being had dismantled him was sobering, but philosophically. Corveth fought for honor, for tradition, for the satisfaction of victory. Marcus fought for Elena. There was simply no contest. "I yield," Corveth said quietly. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in chaos. Zephyrians were stumbling over each other trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Their champion, their undefeated warrior, their symbol of physical perfection, had been casually dismantled by a creature that looked like it would have trouble opening a stubborn jar. Marcus straightened up and extended a hand to help Corveth to his feet. Because that's another thing about humans. They can go from absolutely murderous to helpful neighbor in the time it takes most species to blink. "Good fight," he said cheerfully. Corveth accepted the hand up, his expression somewhere between bewildered and impressed. "How?" he asked simply. "Practice," Marcus replied. "Also, you telegraph your movements something terrible. You might want to work on that." The referee was frantically consulting his ancient rulebook, apparently trying to figure out if there was a precedent for a trial by combat ending in casual life advice. The crowd was still buzzing with confused energy, and several council members looked like they were having quiet, nervous breakdowns. Veltar, the instigator of this whole mess, had gone a particularly interesting shade of purple and appeared to be trying to sink into his seat until he achieved some kind of reverse existence. "By the ancient laws," the referee finally announced, "the human Marcus Chen has achieved victory in trial by combat. The accusations against Elena Chen are hereby dismissed." Elena's shackles dissolved as the release mechanism activated. She stood slowly, her eyes never leaving her husband, and walked across the arena toward him. The crowd parted before her like she was radioactive. When she reached Marcus, she looked him up and down, checking for injuries. Finding none, she nodded approvingly. "Nice technique," she said calmly. "Thanks. I was improvising mostly." "I could tell." They stood there for a moment, completely ignoring the chaos erupting around them. Just two humans in a galaxy full of beings who were rapidly reassessing everything they thought they knew about Earth's diplomatic corps. "So," Elena said finally, "what now?" Marcus looked around the arena, at the stunned crowd, at Corveth, who was still examining his own limbs like he couldn't quite believe they were all still attached, at the council members who were having frantic whispered conversations about damage control. "Now," he said with satisfaction, "I think we renegotiate our mining rights. From a position of strength." Elena smiled. It was the kind of smile that had charmed the Zephyrian Council in the first place. But now it carried an undertone that suggested she was married to someone who solved diplomatic crises by casually dismantling 8-foot-tall alien warriors. "I love it when you talk business," she said, and that, as they say, was that. The Zephyrians, having witnessed their champion treated like a practice dummy by a bored human with a metal stick, suddenly became much more amenable to negotiation. The mining rights were approved with unprecedented speed, along with several additional concessions that Marcus hadn't even bothered to ask for. Veltar was quietly removed from the council for bringing dishonor upon the sacred traditions, and was last seen working in crystal maintenance, which was apparently the Zephyrian equivalent of being demoted to janitor. Corveth, meanwhile, became something of a celebrity. Being the only being in recorded Zephyrian history to survive personal combat with a human, turned out to be quite the resume builder. He parlayed it into a lucrative career as a combat instructor, teaching other aliens how to think like a human in battle. His first lesson, according to reports, was always the same. Expect nothing, prepare for everything, and never, ever threaten their mates. As for Marcus and Elena, they returned to Earth with their mining contracts and a story that entered the legends of the Terran diplomatic corps. Future human ambassadors would find their negotiations considerably easier, as word spread throughout the galaxy about what happened to species who decided to test human resolve. The story grew with each telling, of course. By some versions, Marcus had fought 12 champions simultaneously. In others, he'd lifted Corveth over his head with one hand. A few particularly creative retellings claimed he'd done it all while blindfolded and reciting poetry. Marcus never bothered to correct the exaggerations. He understood, better than most, the value of a good reputation. And Elena? Elena went back to being the perfect diplomat, charming alien councils and negotiating trade agreements with her characteristic grace and patience. But now, everywhere she went, beings looked at her with just a touch more respect, a hint more caution. Because they remembered that behind every diplomatic smile stood someone who had married a human. And humans, as the galaxy was learning, really didn't like it when you hurt their mates. The end result was a period of unprecedented cooperation between Earth and its galactic neighbors. Not out of friendship exactly, but out of a healthy respect for what humans were capable of when properly motivated. Some species called it fear, others called it wisdom. Humans called it Tuesday.